Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So today we're going to start talking about the genus Homo. And as you know, this is our genus. So this is where we start looking at hominins that are much more similar to us than members of the genus Australopithecus or members of the genus Paranthropus that we've talked about recently. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. All right, here we go. So our next evolutionary step is members of the genus Homo. And again, this is us. But there's some questions about which species evolved into our genus. Most people think it was probably Australopithecus afarensis, but there's a lot of difference between afarensis and the earliest members of our genus. So there could be another hominin that served as that missing link, as it were, between Australopithecines and us. We do know, however, that some species of our genus lived at the same time as members of the genus Australopithecus and members of the genus Paranthropus. This includes species like Homo habilis, that we're going to talk about in a second, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo erectus. All of these species of hominin were living on the landscape in the same place at the same time. And it's really interesting to think about what those interactions might have been like. Were they competing for resources? Were they fighting? Were they trying to drive each other out of territory? Or did they trade? Or was their interaction completely neutral? Was it just, that's another creature over there? We don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really interesting research question. There's also the question of who made tools. And we've talked about this before. Because we have multiple hominins on the same landscape at the same time, overlapping with some of the stone tool technology that we find, such as the Oldowan tools and the Acheulean tools, we don't quite know which species made all of these tools. It was long thought that it was just something that our species did. But now we're starting to rethink that and consider that maybe some of the other species before the genus Homo may have been making stone tools. I also want to point out that up until this point, we've had East African species and South African species, and they were different. Now, with the genus Homo, we see the same species across both East Africa and South Africa and moving out of the African continent. So we'll talk about that too. I want you to take a look at the Smithsonian Institution website that includes the hominin family tree. I've placed a link for this on Moodle because the links aren't live in this lecture. So please click on that and click around, look at the different species, and look at how they're connected on this family tree. If you click on each of the species, you can then pull up a different set of information about the species. And then you can actually see some of the individual specimens. You can click on those and read about the individual fossil specimens that have been found. Now, we need to start talking more specifically about Homo habilis. The geologically oldest fossils that fit the criteria for inclusion within our genus were initially discovered by Louis Leakey, who we've talked about before, and he was working at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania in the 1960s. In these hominins, he found the brain was larger than that of Australopithecus. It was approaching more like 600 cubic centimeters, and the teeth were smaller, much more like ours, and the landscape had a lot of Oldowan tools. In fact, these tools were evidence of perhaps a dietary change that could included scavenging. So the dietary shift could have been really important in providing the energy that was necessary to grow a large brain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second too. In other words, the features are probably linked. So with the ability to access new food sources using tools, we were able to grow a larger brain and we were able to adapt to different kinds of environments. It ends up becoming this feedback loop. You get a larger brain that requires more high quality calories, but yet that larger brain allows you to think through problems and create the kinds of tools that you need. So the hominin species that Louis Leakey found is called Homo habilis, and this was called tool-using man. again, the idea that Homo habilis could have been the first one to use tools. Now that, as I said, has been discarded. We know that tools even um, perhaps predate Homo habilis and could have been made by other species, but the nickname sometimes stuck. So Homo habilis, again, tool using man or handyman, um, was dated between about 1.8 and maybe 2.5 million years ago. That's potentially really old and would have really overlapped with some of the other species of the genus Australopithecus and the genus Paranthropus, but may perhaps be that old. Now, Homo habilis had a body that was a little bit more like an Australopithecine, still a fairly short stature, kind of a more barrel-shaped body, but was fully bipedal. And their skull was becoming much, much more like ours. Their brains are about 50% larger than members of the genus Australopithecus, meaning that they have more encephalization, or they're more encephalized. They have a bigger brain. So above the neck, they're much more human-like. Below the neck, they're still a little bit more like an Australopithecus. Now, excuse me, like I said, they were very much bipedal. And this is what Homo habilis probably looked like. You can see the face is still fairly prognathic. You see the lower part of the face sticks out a little bit more. You can see still the heavy brow ridges, and they don't have the high domed forehead like we have just yet. But they're clearly along the lines to hominin species that look more like us. And again, Oldowan tools, sometimes referred to as pebble tools. This is the tool-making technology that was a major adaptation for our hominin ancestors. We start seeing more advanced tools like Acheulean tools by about 1.8, 1.7 million years ago. But Oldowan tools go back as early as about 2.5 million years ago, and they're named for Olduvai Gorge. So think they're the oldest tools, think Oldowan, but it's actually named for Olduvai. However, there's really interesting evidence that Homo habilis was probably not the only species of the early members of the genus Homo to live in East Africa at this time. So if you look here, this is a skull discovered in Kenya in the 1970s that's recently yielded some additional data showing that it's a bit over 2 million years old. It has a larger cranial capacity than most specimens attributed to Homo habilis, or in other words, a larger brain size. And the shape of the face and the tooth rows are a little bit different than what is found in most Homo habilis fossils. There are some researchers who consider this to be a different species and call it Homo rudolfensis, and it's named after Lake Turkana. So prior to independence, Lake Turkana in Kenya was called Lake Rudolph. Now Lake Turkana is called Lake Turkana after the local name and the local tribe that lives there. So Homo rudolfensis, found near Lake Turkana, named after the former name of the lake. And when it was found, the lake was still called Lake Rudolph. There have been some recent discoveries of additional fossils in Kenya that support the idea that there may have been two different early members of the genus Homo coexisting, Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis. However, some regard these differences as normal variation and suggest that we should lump them all together. This is one of these situations where the more specimens we find, the more we'll understand if we're looking at two different species or just variation within a single species. So think about it this way. If you found, of the modern Homo sapiens population, let's say you found a person who was biologically female, was 5 feet tall, and was very gracile, very thin. And let's say you also found the skeleton of an individual who was 6'3", very robust, say a big football player, right? 6'3", very robust and male. If you put these two individuals, if this was all you had that represented Homo sapiens and you had these two individuals, you might be inclined to say that just based on that information, that they were two different species. However, if you have the whole population of humans, you know that they're both within the realm of absolutely normal for the population of humans. It's just a matter of sample size. And we may be looking at that for some of these early hominins. We don't know what the range of variation was that was normal within the species. But the more specimens we find, the more we're able to explain that. So we know that there are some differences between the genus Homo and the genus Australopithecus. We know that Australopithecines were focused on a more narrow range of foods. They may have been using tools, but maybe not all that often. Whereas the strategies that members of the genus Homo were using require the use of tools. So we know for certain that the genus Homo is using tools. The question is, were some of these other generi, the plural of genus, using tools as well? Now, Homo rudolfensis has been clearly dated to between 1.8 and 1.4 million years ago, but data suggests it actually goes back older than that. And this is an image of one of the Homo rudolfensis skulls that was found at Kubifora in Kenya. And this is probably what Homo rudolfensis may have looked like. Again, still fairly prognathic, without the large domed forehead like we have, heavy brow ridges, but very much along the line to us. Now, around 1.8 million years ago, early Homo evolved into a new kind of hominin with an even bigger brain and smaller teeth, teeth that are starting to be even more like ours, and very long human-like legs, a body type that looks like ours. Now, this is Homo erectus. Homo erectus fossils are characterized by other features too, like large brow ridges, and they're still kind of prognathic and don't have the high domed forehead. But unlike every other hominin discovery up till this point in time, fossils of this species are not found just in Africa. Homo erectus was the first to move out of the African continent and colonize other parts of the world. It expanded both within the African continent and moved out and quickly inhabited Europe and Asia, as you can see on this map, which is really exciting. It seems as though once our ancestors developed a modern body type and a bigger brain, they started moving around a lot. Homo erectus is therefore the first global human species. And we've already encountered Homo erectus outside Africa in some of the skulls that you've read about in your textbook before. But this one is the hominin, one of the oldest discovered outside of Africa, and this is the Dmanisi skeleton, or the Dmanisi skull. It's the fossil dates to almost 1.8 million years ago, and it's been found in the country of Georgia. But let's start looking at some of these Homo erectus fossils that have been found in other places. So again, this image is the Dmanisi skull. Now we know that Homo erectus first evolves in Africa, but went very quickly to Europe and Asia. And it was the first hominin to leave Africa. That's really important. It also shows the beginning of a much more modern body plan. So shorter arms, longer legs, a thinner torso, much, much more like us. And Homo erectus was an incredibly successful, evolutionarily, species. So not only did it colonize much of the old world, but it also persisted for about 1.5 million years. Homo erectus in Africa, let's talk about that first, lived at the same time as Paranthropus boisei. And in a few places, you will see African Homo erectus referred to as Homo ergaster. So you should just be aware of that. The African version of the species is sometimes referred to as Homo ergaster. And Homo erectus in Africa, or Homo ergaster, had a large brain, not as big as ours, but much larger than members of the genus Australopithecus, had smaller back teeth. It had still had a large brow ridge and not the high domed forehead like we have, but it's getting more modern. Had long legs, increased body size, but narrow, and much, much more tool use. Now, the reason I'm showing you the image that you see on the slide here is to compare it to Paranthropus boisei. Remember, your textbook refers to this species as Australopithecus boisei. It's one of the robust Australopithecines. The modern genus classification for this is Paranthropus. So Paranthropus boisei, this is an image from your book, has a sagittal crest or sagittal keel. Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster in Africa, does not. Paranthropus boisei has these really large back teeth, large molars. Homo erectus does not, has small teeth like us. So these two species are living in the same place in East Africa at the exact same time. But yet Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster, is much, much more modern looking than Paranthropus boisei is. And Paranthropus boisei ultimately went extinct. Homo erectus not only thrived, but colonized much of the old world. Now, the most famous Homo erectus that we'll talk about is Turkana boy, also called Neriocotomy boy. It was found by Kamoya Kameu, who is a Kenyan who worked on Richard Leakey's team, and they found him on the west side of Lake Turkana. So this particular skeleton is an almost complete skeleton of a juvenile boy. It has, you can see this image of the skeleton, you can see it looks really modern. You know, that long torso, fully modern pelvis, fully modern femur angle. The thing that's really different is kind of from the neck up, it still has some more archaic features. It still has that sloping forehead instead of the high dome, the heavy brow ridges, and is still more prognathic. But the skull is much larger, the cranial capacity is much larger, the brain is much larger than species that went before it. Interestingly about Turkana boy is that there's no evidence that it's climbing trees. It doesn't have those curved phalanges. And the body suggests that it would have actually approached a modern height, a modern average height in adulthood. So Turkana boy would have been about 5'6" and could have grown to about 5'9" or even 6 feet tall as an adult. So that's a full body size. That's a full modern body. We also know a lot about their gait because there have been footprints that have been found. And this is a really interesting site, and it's a site I know a lot about because this was where I worked in Kenya. I wasn't working on the footprint site. I was looking at a more modern site, looking at the transition from hunting and gathering to pastoralist, but we were part of the same project team. In fact, my tent was basically just right across the riverbed from this particular site while it was being excavated. So I'm going to show you some pictures that I took in the field of the Illiret footprint site. Now, in order to understand more about how Homo erectus walked, sites like this, the Illiret footprint site, which is a place where we have multiple tracks of hominins walking through soft mud on what was at one point the shore of a shallow lake where Lake Turkana is today, or next to where Lake Turkana is today. And these footprints have been preserved. Now, just like the Laetoli footprints that we've talked about before as an example of Australopithecus afarensis walking, this site, which we think is a Homo erectus site, shows us how the gait of Homo erectus was much more modern. So the site dates to about 1.5 million years ago, and that's because we have multiple layers of volcanic ash that really sandwich the site. Remember, volcanic ash is easily dated using potassium-argon or argon-argon dating. So the prints that you can see in this picture on the right, this is a schematic of the footprints, are nearly indistinguishable from prints that a modern human would make, indicating that the species moved exactly the same way that we do. The feet are arched like ours. The big toe is in line with the other toes. There's a few places where some of the mud kind of squished up between the toes, but that would happen. That would be within the normal range of variation for modern humans as well. Though the brain was still outside the range of modern humans, the means of locomotion was essentially identical. There's also a skull from Illiret that is a little smaller and has smaller brow ridges than other Homo erectus skulls, but this skull is designated KNM-ER 42700, which basically means that it's the 42nd 700,000th fossil discovered in East Rudolph. ER stands for East Rudolph in Kenya. KNM stands for Kenyan National Museum. So these days, researchers have actually found more than 60,000 hominin fossils, which is pretty amazing. So this indicates just how numerous fossils can be in some of these localities. Now, the Illiret skull indicates that Homo erectus was quite variable and may have still had some of the sexual dimorphism that we see in Australopithecus afarensis. Now, another interesting thing is there have been other hominin fragments found at the site, including an arm that looks like it was mauled by a crocodile. So we see a lot of interesting things at Illiret. But the important reason why we're talking about Illiret today is to talk about those footprints. So you have the schematic of the footprint pattern, and you can see that unlike Laetoli, where it's just a trail of hominins walking in a straight line, these are kind of all over the place. So it appears as though there was a Homo erectus population, certainly more than one, just kind of walking around in the soft mud on the shores of the lake. And what you see in the picture on the left, this is actually what it looks like. So you can see there are lots of different footprints. And in fact, when the site was found, we were excavating, and we were looking at the soil profile, so the cut in the face of the excavation units. And the reason we were excavating there is because some hominin bones had been found eroding out of the surface. We started excavating in there, and someone's looking at the cut face and says, it looks like there's these depressions in that one stratum, that one soil layer there. Let's uncover it and see what it is. Maybe it's animal footprints. We were very excited thinking we had animal footprints that could tell us a lot about the environment during that time. We never even thought that there might be human footprints. So after uncovering it and excavating a little bit, and let me show you an image of what that looks like. So this is out on the site. The gentleman on the left here is Jack Harris. He taught at Rutgers University. He's now retired, but he was the project lead for the Kubi-Fora Field School that this was associated with. And if you look, you can see there's that layer that's covered in plastic. That's to protect some exposed footprints there. But if you look at the soil strata, you can see immediately behind that all of these weird little kind of uneven depressions. And even above that, you can see these weird little uneven depressions. Those are all footprints. And again, initially we thought it was just animals, which could tell us a lot about the environment. But upon excavating, we found there were hominin footprints mixed in. Here's another image of that. You can see some of the researchers excavating. You can see the exposed level here. It's covered up with plastic when excavations aren't happening to protect it. Not so much because it's going to rain. We were working during the dry season, but more importantly, because the wind would blow and it would blow dust all over everything. So every day we would have to come out and brush out the footprints so we could document them. So if we could keep some of that off the footprints, it helped protect it and made it a little easier to expose it every day. But you can see the multiple strata here behind behind where the plastic is. And if you look closely, you can see a layer of volcanic ash that was datable within this soil profile. Yep, and there's a much younger me excavating on this site. So as we were excavating, we were documenting everything we were finding. And this is a mapping tool called a total station that allowed us to document each of the hominin footprints and the animal footprints that were there too. After this particular field season, when things were exposed, we then brought out specialized scanning equipment that took a very detailed 3D scan of the entire footprint sequence. And that allowed the project leads to take it back into the lab and process those imagery data and really get a very, very clear picture and map of the footprints within the site. Here's a much closer view of what that footprint site looked like. So as you're looking at it, there are a couple of places where there are some individual footprints, but what you can also see, I apologize, I'm looking over my shoulder at my other screen. What you can also see are long sort of triangular images here. These are bird footprints. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but on the left image are some triangular impressions. Those are birds. On the right image, if you look closely, you can see a couple of hominin footprints. And this was much easier to ascertain as we got it into the lab and did some post-processing of the scans. But a lot of these excavations, these were all done by hand. Everything had to be brushed out very carefully before it could be scanned. And because this was just dried mud, so unlike Laetoli, where hominins were walking through volcanic ash that ultimately hardened and turned to stone, this is all soft mud, so it's really, really hard to preserve it. If you look in the image on the left, you can see a modern human foot, and right next to it, you can see one of the footprints that was uncovered. And here's another one right here. So you can see a modern human foot, a very dirty archaeologist foot, and right next to it, you can see one of the hominin footprints. So the Illiret footprint site dates to between about 1.51 and 1.53 million years ago, and that's because it's sandwiched between those layers of volcanic ash that were dated using potassium argon or argon dating. And because of the date range and the very modern appearance of the foot, it's probably a Homo erectus. But the research was able to show that they had a very modern gait. They walked just like us, and they had a toe off stride like us. So they have that big toe is really important in that push off. If you saw these footprints on a beach, you would not think twice in assuming that they were Homo sapien. Now, there's a lot of variability among Homo erectus, both in Africa and beyond. And remember, sometimes African Homo erectus is referred to as Homo ergaster. So as you're looking at these images, on the top left is a fossil from Olduvai Gorge that dates to about 1.2 million years ago. And that's OH9 is the name of the specimen. But as you're looking at this, notice it's got a really big brow ridge and a large area for muscle attachments on the back of the skull. Now, this specimen also has really thick bone in the skull. It's very robust for a Homo erectus. Below that is the Dhaka skull, which is about 1 million years old. And this one was found, these are all Homo erectus, and this one was found by Tim White's team in Ethiopia. And the reason why this particular skull is really important is because it looks very similar to the Homo erectus fossils that have been found in Asia, which we're going to talk more about in just a second. So there are some researchers who were beginning to think that the African Homo erectus fossils were different enough from the Asian Homo erectus fossils to call them a different species. Again, this is where Homo ergaster came from. But there's also others who think we should not split up these species. So it depends on who you're talking to. The image on the upper right is a later Homo erectus fossil, also from Ethiopia, called Bodo, and it's only 600,000 years old and has a brain size that's much more similar to the brain size of modern humans today. So it's 1,000,000 years younger than some of the first Homo erectus fossils that we started talking about, like Turkana boy, Nariocotomy boy from Kenya. So what this is showing, because Bodo is so much more recent, what this is showing is that brain size is gradually increasing over the evolutionary trajectory of Homo erectus. And as we've already talked about, these Homo erectus species are migrating out of Africa very quickly. So we have Homo erectus found in Europe, in a few places in Europe. We have Homo erectus in Asia, all the way down into Southeast Asia. So we're going to talk about some of these in just a second. So one of the earliest fossils of Homo erectus found outside of Africa is the Dmanisi skull, or Dmanisi. There's actually multiple Homo erectus specimens found at Dmanisi, and this is in Georgia. So Dmanisi actually turned out to be one of the most productive early Homo erectus fossil sites that have ever been found. There are several skeletons found. There have been 5 skulls found, including the one shown here. The cranial capacity of the Dmanisi Homo erectus ranges between about 600 and 750 cubic centimeters, which includes the upper range of Homo habilis as well as into Homo erectus. So it's a smaller brained specimen of Homo erectus than some of the Homo erectus skulls that we find later. There's also been Homo erectus found in Indonesia. So the first Homo erectus skull actually ever found was found in Asia, in Indonesia, referred to as Pithecanthropus erectus. We now know that is a member of the genus Homo. Now, Homo erectus in Indonesia included specimens like the Sangharan skull that has a lot of older characteristics. So it is a long, low skull, does not have our domed forehead, has a very thick brow ridge, and a heavy neck muscle attachment in the back. It also has a relatively large face with big cheekbones, and it's still very prognathic. This specimen has a large brain. It's about 1,000 cubic centimeters, not quite in the range of modern humans, but certainly much bigger than Australopithecus and much bigger than some of the early Homo erectus species. So it also has a little bit of a sagittal keel across the top of the skull. So not as much as members of the genus Paranthropus, of course, but a little bit more of a muscle attachment along the middle of the skull here. Now, the other thing that I should just point out that's on the slide is that it does have some similarities with some of the African species too. So what this suggests is that there may have been, we've talked about gene flow, there may have been some connections between the Asian Homo erectus and the African Homo erectus. And perhaps these populations were moving about quite a bit on the landscape. We also have Homo erectus in China, very famous specimen that became known as Peking man. This particular Homo erectus had kind of a mid-sized brain for Homo erectus, about 800 cubic centimeters. And this was a very early find, Peking man in China. And this was actually the one you remember we talked about when we talked about Louis Leakey, when he was first proposing his ideas about human evolution occurring in Africa. He was countering the idea that humans evolved in Asia, which was largely based on this Peking man find. Now we know our earliest hominin ancestors originated in Africa. This is another image of Peking man. This is, again, Homo erectus, found in China and found in a cave site. So Homo erectus was, at least in China and probably in some other areas, moving into cave sites as these caves, limestone dissolves within an area, it creates an exposure, and a lot of hominins used these as places to shelter. In the 1920s and 1930s, remains of up to 50 individuals were found in China at the site of Zhaoqiudian, not my native language, including several nearly complete skulls. Now, these fossils date to over 400,000 years ago. If you see YBP, that stands for years before present. So 400,000 years before present. And some very recent dating methods have suggested that they're about 780,000 years old. So unlike other cave localities in which the fossil bones of hominins were probably washed into caves or accidentally deposited by carnivores or scavengers, these caves in China were places that Homo erectus actually lived. They were using these resources. And we know that because these cave sites preserve the remains of stone tools and evidence for controlled fire. Unfortunately, the entire fossil collection was lost during World War II, but an early paleoanthropologist had made detailed copies and casts of the Peking man fossils, so we do have a record of these, even if the originals are no longer present. The fossil record seems to indicate that early Homo erectus populations migrating out of Africa generally kind of took a right and headed east into Asia. However, there is some evidence from sites in Spain that by at least 1.2 million years ago, these hominins started going the other way and going west into Europe. One of the oldest sites that has yielded hominin fossils in Europe is called Grandolina, which is about 900,000 years old. So if you look on this slide, you can see a map of where it's located. And we'll also talk about Atapuerca too. The image on the right is the face of one of the hominins that was found at this site. And this particular specimen happens to be a child, but there were a lot of adult bones found there too. Now, in many ways, these fossils are like those of Homo erectus that's been found elsewhere. However, there are some differences too. The nose is a little wider, and they're a little more robust than Homo erectus generally found at this point in time in Africa, and even some of the Homo erectus fossils that have been found in Asia. The European fossils begin to look a little bit more like Neanderthals, like some of the other species that come later in Europe. And it appears as though Homo erectus migrated into Europe and became somewhat isolated from the rest of the Homo erectus population. And this isolation led to some anatomical differences that eventually resulted in the group we call Neanderthals. Now, some researchers have said that this Homo erectus to Neanderthal transitional species should be called Homo antecessor. Others have argued it's a regional variant of Homo erectus, but a lot of people are thinking that this may be a bridge between Homo erectus and Neanderthals, Homo antecessor. So by the time we reach Homo erectus, especially later Homo erectus, living about 500,000 years ago in Asia, Africa, and Europe, these hominins begin to really look much more modern. They begin to really resemble you and me. They have brain sizes that are within or really close to the low range of human brain sizes today. They have small teeth like ours. They rely really heavily on material culture like tools to survive. We know they controlled fire. They cook their food, something that we'll talk about more. And they have long legs and a bipedal gait that is exactly like ours. Many of the biological features that we find in humans today evolved not as late as Homo sapiens, but actually showed up in our ancestor, Homo erectus. And as illustrated on this slide, Homo erectus evolved. You can see this is from your book, but as you're looking at this slide, Homo erectus evolved smaller teeth and smaller jaws compared to previous species. The brain is bigger, although their skull still has those heavy brow ridges and is a little bit more prognathic. But Homo erectus evolved a body like ours, a long-legged body like ours. And so now we have to think about kind of why this evolutionary trajectory happened. Most likely, one of the forces behind all these changes involved changes in diet and how these hominins accessed resources from their environment. So Homo erectus was probably doing some kind of hunting and definitely ate more meat than other previous hominins. So meat eating probably started before Homo erectus, maybe scavenging, as we've talked about before, as we see in cut marks on bone that overlay scavenger tooth marks or carnivore tooth marks. But Homo erectus is associated with more sophisticated tools, particularly Acheulean tools, like those hand axes that we've talked about. The hand axe is the most common type of Acheulean tool, but there are others. So if you look at the slide on the lower left, you can see cut marks on bone. You see those small little striations? Those were made by stone tools. And on the lower right, you can see a bone that has been crushed using some kind of chopping tool. On the upper left, you are looking at a site in Kenya called Olgosaile, which there were hundreds of hand axes all over the ground. And on the upper right, you can see a close-up of some of those images. Now, additional cultural innovation that was really, really important for Homo erectus was controlling fire. Fire is really important because it allowed Homo erectus to stay warm and move into different kinds of environments. So you're able to move into colder climates if you can control fire. It also is a great way to keep predators away. You know, if you have a campfire, generally a lot of predators will stay away from that. But most importantly, it allowed hominins to cook their food. And cooking food does two things. It makes the food softer. Well, three things. It makes it less dangerous. It kills a lot of pathogens in food. So if you cook your food, it's safer. You're less likely to get sick. And third, cooking food actually makes more nutrients bioavailable, meaning that our bodies absorb the nutrients a little bit more effectively if food is cooked versus not cooked. So Homo erectus had a lot of advantages. Their new strategies included consuming more meat, hunting rather than scavenging, better tools, those Acheulean hand axes we talked about. They're using fire for warmth and cooking, and they're doing all of this fairly early. We see the use of fire in Africa by 1.5 million years ago, in China by 300,000 years ago, but they're probably doing it earlier than that as well. Now, this is just an artistic reconstruction of Homo erectus butchering a carcass, but it's informed by fossil evidence. So we know that hand axes can be used to cut, to scrape, and to chop meat from a carcass, like the zebra that you see in this picture, because these tools are often found in association with these kinds of carcasses. We also know that Homo erectus lived in a group, may have shared resources and shared food, and certainly shared the task of butchering and probably also keeping other scavengers at bay. Now, the reason why meat and cooking food is so important is because of our large brains. So, even though brains are only about 2% of our body mass, they use up about 20% of our body's energy. So, if nutrients are scarce, having a large brain would actually be really detrimental to an individual and could lead to selection against large brains. So, large brains can only evolve if there's enough nutrition to support them, that tissue that's so energetically expensive. This happened with Homo erectus, and it created this kind of feedback loop where the larger brained individuals are presumably more intelligent and could make better tools, could adapt, could plan ahead, could develop a culture that gave them real advantages. But they needed those advantages because they needed to get more food in order to feed that large brain. So our brain was a big advantage, but it also meant that we had to work a lot harder or work a lot smarter, as it were, in order to get enough food to feed that large brain. But there are also some other hominins that are kind of these weird creatures out on the landscape that we're not quite sure how they fit. So in South Africa, there was a species, this was very recently discovered, called Homo naledi. And if you want to learn more about this, I can. There are a couple of great videos about Homo naledi out there. So Homo naledi was found in South Africa in a cave site called Rising Star Cave. It dates to about 335 to 236 years ago. Again, that YBP means years before present. And it's near some Australopithecine sites, but it's clearly not Australopithecus. In this particular cave site, there have been hundreds, and in fact, basically thousands, they've been continuing to work there, of bone fragments that have been found of at least 15 individuals. And the skeletons are a little different. They still have a muscle attachment here, they have a large brow ridge, they have a big, thick, heavy skull, but they have a tooth size that's smaller, like Homo erectus, and a small brain, like the Australopithecines. The other interesting thing about this particular site is that it hasn't really included any tools. So it is just bone. And in fact, it's almost exclusively hominin bone. Apparently, there was an owl that was found in there too, but it's almost exclusively hominin bone. So it has some similarities to the earlier Australopithecines with a small brain and body size. It has slightly curved phalanges. The femur shape is a little bit different, a little more like Australopithecines, but it also has a lot of similarities to us. And there's some theories that maybe this particular cave was a burial site, that maybe hominins were dragging dead individuals into the cave or dropping them through an opening in the top. It's something that's still very much being researched. The lead researcher on this is a man named Lee Berger, who has been running a major research project in these cave sites in South Africa. There have been some others. There's a mandible that's been found in Indonesia that's only dates to about 700,000 years ago. That's really small. And strangely, on the island of Flores in Indonesia, there was a hominin that's been nicknamed the Hobbit because it's very, very small, that only dates to between 100 and 60,000 years ago. Now, what's interesting about this is that you have Homo sapiens moving into this part of Southeast Asia at about the same time. So this species, very small, perhaps representing something called island dwarfism. So we have lots of hominins on the landscape at the same time and a very complex picture. But what happened next was that we emerged, and ultimately, for thousands of years, it was us and Neanderthals, and then Neanderthals went extinct, and we were the only hominins that remained. So we're going to talk more about that next class. All right, I'll see you then.